Hello everyone and welcome to Tech with Robert, the Get Started with T-SQL course. In this lecture we're going to talk about the aggregate function count. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, give a thumbs up on the video if you like what I do. That really helps me to know what I do well and what you guys want me to improve on or focus more on in the future lectures. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I just want to start off this lecture by mentioning something that I didn't mention in the end of the last video, and I just want to highlight that before we move on and talk about the count function. So we had a query where we took the order date and we used the sum and the sales amount and we grouped it by the order date. And we talked about here that instead of showing all of the different individual sales transactions on the 29th of December, it's going to aggregate all of these to summarize them and then show it only once here. I forgot to mention something that I want to highlight, which is very important. It's that what if we said here that, okay, we don't want to see every individual day like this in a year, but we want to aggregate it and we want to see, for example, let's say that you think that, oh, okay, but I think that I had much higher sales in 2011 compared to 2010, for example. So you want to group it up by year instead of the actual date here. And so we learned in the previous lectures that if you want to get the year out of a date column, you can use the year function. So we could type year here and we could name it for order. You can give it an alias and name it order year, for example. Now watch what happens if I have a function here. So I've modified the order date column. I'm not just using it directly as it is. I'm modifying it by using the year function, but I still have order date like this in the group by clause. And notice what's going to happen. It's going to, as many of you expected, it's just going to say the year here, and instead of showing all of the dates, it's going to say the year here instead. And so that is because when you are modifying it here, so saying that you want to use the year of the order date, you also have to do the same function here in the order by clause. And so now when I run the query, you see that it's going to group everything up by the year. So we see here we have 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and so on. And so that is just something I wanted to highlight, because as you notice, it still worked by just typing group by order date, even though here in the select clause we have year of order date and here we just have order date. It still worked. But if you want to do the actual calculation that you expected, so to group it by the year, you have to type year as well here. So now we can move on and talk about the count. So let me just write a query here. I think we're pretty familiar with this query route by now, but we can say here, we say we want the customer key, we want the first name, and we want the last name, and let's just say we want the email address, okay, from the dim customer. And if we order this by, let's say, the first name, we see that we have 18,484 rows. So this is how many rows we have in the table, because we don't have any filters now. We're just basically extracting everything from the table as is. So we get the number of rows. So this is how many rows we have in this table, right? And we could say we could see the same result if we were to write select count star. This means count everything, all right? I would say from the customer. You see, we will get this number right over here. So if we copy that, you do a double dasher as a comment, we could type it out here. And so notice now when we just run this query here, we get 18,484 rows, and it's the same that we get here. So when you're using the count star, we're basically just counting all of the rows in a table. But you can also you can count a specific column, so you don't have to count you don't have to use the count star here. But so let's say, for example, we use select count and we say we want to count the first name from the customer. And I'm going to explain why you need to be careful when using this method here, instead of not only using the star here to count everything. But I'm going to leave it for a little bit now. But notice what happens when I say I want to select the count first name from dim customer. I get the same result. Okay? And that is because when I write this query here, it's just going to say, okay, so here we have one value, Aaron. Then we go to the next row, Aaron, and then third, Aaron. And so we're basically just counting all of the rows here for the first name. And so that is a big misconception, because sometimes people want to say, oh, okay, but I want to see how many different first names we have in the customer table. And then they would write something like, select count first name. They think that, okay, but we're counting all of the different first names that we have in the dim customer. But if you just write the query like this is going to be the exact same thing as typing select count star here, with a small modification, which I will talk about soon. But for now, just think that this is the exact same thing as this. So if you actually wanted to see, so how many different unique first names do we have in the customer table? I showed you in a previous lecture that we could use select distinct. And so you can use this in combination with the count function. So you could write and say select count and then open and closing parentheses, and in here you can type distinct and then you write first name like this. So now when we run this query, we see that we get 670. And so what this means is that now we actually run that query that we expected. So this is how many different type of names, first names, do we have in the table dim customer. So we have 670 different rows. So if we take this query again and we see for Aaron here, we have Aaron all the way down to the 54th row. So we have 53 rows. We have 53 customers whose first name is Aaron. And now Aaron is only going to be counted once here. So that is only one out of these 770, because we use the distinct first name here in the count function. And so usually I'm just going to show another query. So we could say, for example, if we wanted to see, okay, we want to group by all of the first name, and we want to say, for example, how many customers do we have whose first name is Aaron, whose first name is John, Joe, or whatever. We could write the function and the query the same way as we wrote it with the previous one in the previous lecture with the sales, but using the count instead. So we could say we want to select the first name, and then we want to select count star, and we say from dim customer, and we say group by first name, and we can say we order by one, for example. So now when we see here, we see that we can just give it an alias and say number of occurrences, for example. If we run this, we see that, okay, as we saw earlier, we have 53 customers whose name is Aaron, we have 19 customers whose name is Abby, 1 for Abjit, 51 for Adam, and so on. As I mentioned previously, I usually, when I use the count function, I usually use count star. You need to know how it works when you are using the count function in combination with a column like this. Well, first off, as I mentioned, there's a big difference between just saying count first name and then count the distinct first name. There's two completely different results, and just using the count first name like this, it's going to give the same number of rows as using count star. But that is not actually the whole truth. So I'm going to use the table that I used in a couple of previous lectures, and if you don't have that tables saved, I'm going to link the code in the description. So we say that we have the customers table like this. Okay, so I'm going to say I want the customer ID, I want the customer first name, I want the last name, and I want the customer phone. Okay, so here you see we have 8 different customers, and we see that for the phone number here we have one value that is null. Now, so what happens if we say like this? We say select count star from that table. We can see the number of rows. We see, as expected, we will get 8. But what happens if we now write count and we say customer phone here? We can name it count, customer phone count. You expect this value to be 8, right? Because this query here, select count star from dim customer, generated this amount of rows, and the same when we used count first name, it was the same amount of rows. So as this count star here generated 8 rows, this query should also generate 8 rows, right? But notice what happens when we run this. We get 7 rows. And so why is that? So when we use count and we specify a column like this, we have to understand, you have to understand that it's not going to count the null value, or values in plural. So notice here, the count everything, that is basically just saying, give us all of the rows, and that doesn't care about null. So if all of these 8 values here for the customer phone were to be null, it doesn't matter. It would still generate 8, because it's when you use the count star, it's counting all of the rows in that group in that table. But when you're using count with another column, a specified column like we do here with customer phone, it's not going to count the rows that have a null value. And so you sort of need to understand this, because otherwise you could miss some rows, which would skew the results, and you would simply just get the wrong number. So that is something that you really must take into consideration. So when you use the count on a specific column like this, it does not count the null values. So here we get 8 and here we get 7 instead. And that is the difference between these two, because here this simply means that we have no row in the customer table where the first name is null. So every single customer has a value that is not null in the first name column. So that is it for this lecture, guys. In the next lecture we're going to continue talking about aggregate functions, but we're going to take a look at the min and the max functions. So I will see you guys in the next lecture.